Neil De Beer, in this really interesting interview, is actually explaining how South Africa might have just really experienced the master negotiator of CODESA in the person of Cyril Ramaphosa, and how we might have seen a reincarnation of the Ramaphosa of CODESA in handling the negotiations that have actually just gone down in the formation of the Government of National Unity and where South Africa is today. Let's listen to how he explains what might be a reincarnation of the Ramaphosa of CODESA, and I'll be back for some really interesting analysis on an interview by President Cyril Ramaphosa in 1994, in the days prior to South Africa becoming a rainbow nation in 1994.
This is not my first rodeo. This total happening of the Government of National Unity talks, I have gone through two of them. One was I experienced some of CODESA, and I experienced the whole MPC multi-party chartered journey. Both of those, can I call it, highlight national debates were based on the same principle. In the multi-party charter, the founding members, when we started, invited any party in this country that had the same vision, the same ideology, and the same understanding to join. We got a flurry of parties that wanted to join, and some of them did, and some of them we rejected. So this is the same thing. And by the way, I can only talk because I know how the DA, can I call it IFP, Freedom Front, I've worked with them for a year and a half weekly, and that is the negotiations that will go on. We don't know who's going to come in, but they must align. And this is the same format. So what is also extra special, and here's the thing, Cyril Ramaphosa, the Cyril of the CODESA negotiations, a week ago came out. There he is. He jumped up, and there we now see the old negotiator coming in and putting down his iron rod. And we were waiting for that. I was waiting for not the President Cyril, not the Cyril we know, but the old negotiator that must come in, and this is also not his first rate. So there we are. We saw it. It's there. And now you've got to sit down and say, the extra parties that are coming in, the ones that are causing maybe a little bit of a shift, you can't stop that, and they are sitting and dealing with it, as I know, currently day by day.
Brilliant, brilliant. What do you guys think? I think it's really why I really enjoyed so much, I've been longing to conduct a research on CODESA and, everything that had to go down for CODESA, for South Africa democratic transition to go smoothly. And I remember Helen Zille mentioning in an interview, I'll be making a video on it, on how CODESA actually, how the GNU negotiation actually borrowed a term from CODESA, which was this kind of like a collective consensus, in a way that explained how the multiple parties in CODESA had to reach a certain consensus before they could push a policy forward. And Neil De Beer now bringing the strength which Ramaphosa actually exerted during the negotiations at CODESA, bringing that back into the negotiations for the formation of the GNU, actually tells a lot about President Cyril Ramaphosa and how probably, his role at this time is really crucial, borrowing from the strength with which he exerted, the transition to a democratic rule in South Africa, playing that role once more in the formation of this Government of National Unity. And as much as many people think that the GNU isn't a perfect fit for South Africa, but, in the short term, it might probably serve as a basket, sort of like, or what probably might be called a transition to a unity government, a real unity government. So not necessarily like a transition from apartheid to democracy in 1994, but this might be now a transition from what has been a democracy in South Africa, although I call it a dictatorial democracy, so to speak, because it's been a democracy that's been, governed and really carried on by one party. This might now be Ramaphosa using his negotiation strength from CODESA to help South Africa transit from what has been a democracy to a much more nuanced uh, form of unity that South Africa really needs at the moment. And so it's really interesting that Nea Debe brings up this point, and President Ramaphosa's really strength in that negotiation. And we see a lot of clashes with the DA and the ANC before they came to an agreement to form a cabinet that was really announced recently. And so I thought it was really interesting to really also go through President Ramaphosa's state of mind in 1994. So I found a research, and I conducted a semi-mini research based on an interview which President Cyril Ramaphosa had in 1994, where he explained his anticipations, how he saw South Africa in 1994. And this was years before he would later be president by 2018. But, to understand how he saw South Africa, what was his vision for this freshly, newly born democratic state in 1994. And I thought it was really interesting that we can actually go in depth to really understand this President Ramaphosa of 1994 and probably make a comparison of the President Ramaphosa we see today. Okay, so it argues that President Cyril Ramaphosa himself was born in Johannesburg, and it epitomizes South Africa's resistance struggle, right? So the fact that he was born in Johannesburg actually epitomizes South Africa's resistance struggle. It says growing up in Western Native Township and Soweto, Ramaphosa became active in student politics while studying for his Bachelor of Procuration at the University of the North, which is Turf Loop. It says that in 1972, Ramaphosa joined the South African Student Organization, which is brief for SASO, and also he was the chairman of the Student Christian Movement. I found a really interesting picture, from a book showing this, actually from a friend. A friend actually shared this picture with me of President Cyril Ramaphosa, being a chair of the student Christian movement, you see. And so he actually was a really strong proponent of Christianity at the time, being a chairman of the student Christian movement, I believe at this University of the North at Turf Loop. So it goes on to show that, President Cyril Ramaphosa's activism led to his 11-month detention in 1974 under the Terrorism Act at Pretoria Central Prison, where he was held in solitary confinement for participating in a pro-Frelimo rally, right? So I've been doing a short research on the whole thing with Frelimo, and I think Frelimo was a really interesting movement. This was I'll quickly try to grab the country. I think this was in Mozambique, if I'm not mistaken. Frelimo was a nationalist movement, in Mozambique, and it was a democratic socialist political party, this in Mozambique, right? And so we know that in Mozambique, when we hear Mozambique, we hear of the likes of some of the names in the Mozambique movement, especially in terms of the Marxists that led the revolution in Mozambique. We hear of such hardline names like Sergio Vieira. We know of George Rebelo and Marcelino dos Santos. This particular name I've actually been looking for. It's actually just over the top of my head at the moment, but I'm actually gonna yes, Samora Machel. That's the name of it. So whenever you hear Mozambique resistance movements in Frelimo, one of the names that comes to mind a lot is Samora Machel and his role in the fight for the liberation struggle in Mozambique. And so Ramaphosa was actually jailed during this time in 1974 because of his participation in this pro-Frelimo rally in 1974. And so it says that despite his imprisonment, right, Ramaphosa remained resilient, becoming involved with the Black People's Convention, the BPC, and holding various committee positions. And this is one thing I enjoy about, President Ramaphosa, because despite the fact that he was a chair of the student Christian movement, those of us who are Christians, we understand that, Many Christians today actually sort of like are silent. I don't know about in South Africa anyway, but in Nigeria, many critiques have actually criticized a lot of the Christians in Nigeria for being silent amidst a lot of corruption going on in Nigeria at the moment, and that they should speak up and they have to try to get out. Although we know that the religion of Christianity preaches love and, kind of like being in a peaceful state with your maker. But a lot of the critics have argued that, the present silence of many of the Christians in South Africa is one of the reasons that many things actually keep going wrong in the country at the moment. So it's really interesting for me that President Cyril Ramaphosa, although he was the chair of the student Christian movement at the time, in this University of the North in Turf Loop, he still kind of like was really attentive to the liberation movement that were going on around South Africa at the time, and really conversant with the liberation struggles, taking part in Frelimo and Frelimo rallying in South Africa and being jailed for that. That was really interesting for me to discover. But also it says that so despite his imprisonment, he was resilient, and he became involved with the Black People's Convention, which is the BPC, and he held various committee positions at this time. So I don't know if probably he was still the chair of the Christian movement at this time, now that he was getting deeper into his participation in these liberation movements. So he said Ramaphosa continued his education by securing articles with the Johannesburg law firm, and in 1976, following the Soweto unrest, Ramaphosa was detained again for 6 months at John Vorster Square. After his release, he pursued legal studies at the University of South Africa, earning his bachelor at procuration and completing his articles in 1981. Now, instead of practicing law privately, Ramaphosa joined the trade union movement as a legal advisor for the Council of Unions of South Africa, which is shortened for CUSA, C-U-S-A. It says that Ramaphosa's legal expertise was further recognized in October 1991, where he served as a visiting professor of law at Stanford University in the United States. So it also says that Ramaphosa's extensive experience highlights his dedication and capacity in mobilizing the populace to end oppression and reconstruct society. His international reputation was cemented when he became the first General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, which is for NUM, which was established by the CUSA. So the CUSA now is kind of the Council of the Unions of South Africa. So the Council of the Unions of South Africa established the National Union of Mine Workers, and to which President Cyril Ramaphosa was the first General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers, all right? And this was in 1982, in which it was established. Now, it argues that under Ramaphosa's leadership, National Union of Mine Workers membership soared from 6,000 to approximately 340,000 within 4 months, becoming the first unregistered trade union acknowledged by the Chamber of Mines as representing Black mine workers. So there's something about his leadership that still felt attractive at this time. And many people have said it that, the ANC today is popular because of President Ramaphosa, that, although, especially as Zuma criticizes the ANC, that he wouldn't work, he doesn't mind to work with the ANC, but he wouldn't work with the ANC and Ramaphosa. Many have argued that, Ramaphosa today is still popular as the head of the ANC, and the ANC still retains some relevance because of his leadership. So probably this goes back to, his leadership in the National Union of Mine Workers, formed in 1982, when here it argues that, the membership, after he became the Secretary General of the union, membership soared from 6,000, which it was initially, to 340,000. So that speaks a lot of the kind of leadership President Cyril Ramaphosa, embodies, you see. So it also says that by September of 1984, Ramaphosa spearheaded South Africa's first legal strike by Black mine workers, and he was instrumental in establishing the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which is COSATU, in 1985. So Ramaphosa has really been around, COSATU is a coalition of trade unions, right? And he said that throughout the 1980s, Ramaphosa linked the workers' struggle with the wider anti-apartheid movement, leading to a nationwide general strike in August of 1992, organized by the ANC and backed by the labor unions. Now, it also says that in July of 1991, at the ANC's national conference in Durban, Ramaphosa was elected Secretary General of the ANC, And in his capacity, he led the ANC's negotiations commission and participated in a conference for a democratic South Africa, which is CODESA. So this is the same CODESA. Neo Debe argues that Ramaphosa, and his negotiation strengths at this time was what probably South Africa might have seen now in the negotiations for the government of national unity. So it says that CODESA was instrumental in transitioning South Africa to majority rule, and President Ramaphosa's extensive achievements were internationally acknowledged when he became the inaugural recipient of the Olof Palme Prize, which honors outstanding contributions to peace, disarmament, international standing, and common security. So it also says that, the accolade highlights the significant impacts of Ramaphosa's 2 decades of leadership in the struggle for majority rule in South Africa. So anyway, we'll dive into the interview. So the interviewer asked Ramaphosa, this is an interview in the 1990s, I suspect this is 1994 or 1995, just at the cusp of a move into democracy in South Africa. So Ramaphosa has asked that, what measures are being implemented to transition the ANC from a movement, right? So we know that the ANC was this anti-apartheid movement. He was asked what arrangements were made to transition the ANC from a movement into a political party. And remember, this is the critique that a lot of critiques of South African history argue that the reason why South Africa is the ANC actually might have failed South Africa a lot is because of the fact that it was actually a movement and not a political party, So it wasn't really equipped to govern a nation, but it was equipped to really represent a liberation movement for the blacks in South Africa at the time. But anyway, so this question actually kind of like tried to get into Ramaphosa's mind to really understand what arrangements were made by the ANC to help it transition from a state as a liberation movement into a political party that would eventually govern a democratic South Africa. So Ramaphosa actually, by 1994, in response to this question, Ramaphosa actually argued that, here he's actually arguing that, the ANC has participated in parliamentary elections for the first time and holds the majority position in government of national unity, right? So this is GNU of 1994. So it says that the ANC held the majority position of the government of national unity in 1994. It also says that the ANC now faces the task of determining how to adapt to this new role. Will it evolve into a political party? So this is Ramaphosa speaking, remember. Ramaphosa is asking, will it evolve into a political party similar to those in Western democracies, which primarily exist to contest elections periodically, or will it continue to serve as the leading force in a broad liberation movement with a program that includes, but is not limited to, pursuing formal political power? So these are questions Ramaphosa is trying to grapple with in 1994. Thirdly, he's asking himself and also in response to the interview that, well, will the ANC transform into something entirely different? He doesn't know. But here today in 2024, we see that, probably the ANC sort of like has transformed into something like a container, so to speak, that actually drives or fights for, the government of negotiations for the government of national unity, but now within the conference and the context of the different political parties that make up the post-1994 democratic state of South Africa. All right. So Ramaphosa continues. Ramaphosa argues that he's saying that these questions must be addressed by the ANC National Conference, which is constitutionally mandated to convene this year. Ramaphosa went on to say that there has been considerable debate on this issue, and a growing consensus suggests that the ANC should maintain its role within the broad liberation movement, continuing to lead a wide range of social movements outside of government, and the ANC must persist in addressing challenges that could impede the process of democratization and transformation. Specifically, Ramaphosa argues here that specifically the implementation of the reconstruction and the development program, so this is the RDP, could encounter several obstacles, many of which are tied to the unique nature of the government of national unity. And he says that this government of national unity includes elements with interests as contradictory to those of the National Party and the ANC, for which there is no historical precedent. Okay, so this issue of RDP, which Julius Malema really criticizes the ANC for, and also many DA proponents, I've heard interviews like from Chris Pappas, who argues that many RDP houses, many blacks living in RDP houses do not have what's the name he calls this, kind of like a document that actually states that those houses belong to them, and so they can be kicked out at any time. And so the DA would, one of the policies of the DA would be to kind of like give that document, you see, to those owners of RDP houses so that they won't be kicked out, in the event of that. So Ramaphosa goes on to say that, the RDP may encounter opposition not only from the National Party within the parliament and the cabinet, but also from elements within the civil service, business sector, parastatals, and other centers of power. So from this statement, anyway, it's really interesting for me to understand that, the GNU at this time had, the cabinet was made, with the National Party, the ANC, and Ramaphosa argues that the RDP may encounter opposition not only from the National Party within the parliament and the cabinet, but also from elements within the civil service, you see. So yeah, this is actually giving us a framework of the kind of opposition that we might also expect in this government of national unity. So by 1994, there was a lot of opposition to policies, from the National Party and the cabinet at the time, which is also similar to what we actually see here, but not so much, because it's tricky now, because we see that the EFF and the MK party, especially the MK being led by George Schlope, seem to be representing a form of like an opposition, so probably a second tier opposition to the opposition that we would also already expect within the government of national unity, or those parties that have signed to become members of the government of national, and those whose members have been sworn into the cabinet at the moment. So we might expect in this GNU of 2024, we might expect it to be different from the GNU of 1994, in that there might be a two-tier opposition, right? So there's still a cabinet that's made up of parties that do not want to be a part of the GNU, right? But at the same time, they might represent a really vociferous opposition to the opposition that is already encapsulated within the GNU, as it is. So it's a really interesting development, which we'll keep studying here on this channel. So he argues that, Ramaphosa goes on to say in 1994 here that, one of the opposition that the RDP might encounter would be opposition from elements within the civil service, the business sectors, and the parastatals and other centers of power. And that he argues that one of the roles of the ANC outside Parliament would be to contribute to parliamentary processes, thereby enhancing Parliament's capacity to challenge opposition within these power centers. You see, so this is really interesting and really important to note, to understand how the GNU today would likely function, or how it differs from the GNU of 1994. So Ramaphosa in 1994 argues that one of the roles of the ANC outside the parliament would be to contribute to parliamentary processes, thereby enhancing Parliament's capacity to challenge opposition within these power centers. So the ANC at 1994, outside of the parliament, really was active in a way to form a sort of like opposition, to be able to oppose most of the opposition that would be coming in from, the civil service, the business sector, the parastatals, and other centers of power, right? But now that the ANC has kind of like what Julius Malema, many people call the marriage between the ANC and the DA, who form the majority of the GNU at the moment, and how that marriage, or how the ANC would operate as it tries to oppose business in South Africa, or the civil service, or other parastatals, it's really tricky at the moment. It's really difficult to understand. But anyway, we'll keep trying to understand how that works. But anyway, Ramaphosa goes on to argue continuously. He's saying that, however, this is not the sole function of the ANC. And as an organization of popular power, the ANC should also empower individuals to exercise their rights within their local branches and communities. All right. So this is the position of the ANC and the position of Ramaphosa's political, anticipations for the party as it just transited into from a liberation struggle movement to a political party. Now, when the interviewer asked Ramaphosa if he foresees the labor movement and the trade union contributing to safeguarding workers' rights and collaborating with the government in economic transformation, and this is a really important question, because as of today, I see a lot of speeches from many COSATU members, really angry with the government of national unity, and many things about the government of national unity, the unions generally, and we know that the DA is really in opposition of the unions, and many DA policies want to really, and I think FF Plus, I think I made a research on the manifesto of the Freedom Front Plus, and many of them want to really loosen the power of the unions and in the push of many policies in South Africa forward, you see. And so this is a really interesting question. And Ramaphosa argues that, in terms of how he foresees the labor movement and the trade union contributing to safeguarding workers' rights, Ramaphosa argues that the RDP's fundamental principle is to uphold and expand upon the rights that the labor movement has secured over time. Ramaphosa argues that it is imperative to empower organized labor to play a robust role in the country's reconstruction and development, and all workers should enjoy equal rights under a unified set of labor laws. Now, arguing Ramaphosa, he argues that critical components of the RDP, such as promoting collective bargaining, setting minimum wage standards, implementing affirmative action, advancing education and training, fostering technological progress, and providing comprehensive services and social security, must work together to achieve a living wage for both rural and urban workers and narrow wage disparities. He argues that sustainable growth levels necessary for the successful execution of the RDP can only be attained through consensus on living wage policies among government, the labor movement, and the private sector. So, in response to also the final question about, what institutional frameworks and policies will the ANC government implement to ensure civilian oversight of the security forces, that specifically the South African Defense Forces and the South African Police. Ramaphosa argues that, the defense forces, which is the police and the intelligence services, which Neo de Beer actually many times has argued that he was, staff of. Ramaphosa argues that in 1994, the ANC believed that the defense forces, the police, and the intelligence forces, they had to be unequivocally be under civilian control, right? So in other words, the police, the defense forces, the police, and the intelligence service, according to ANC logic, was to be under civilian control, especially primarily through the appropriate civilian ministry accountable to parliament. So this was the arrangement. It feels like, my research in Ghana during Jerry Rawlings' time, when during Jerry Rawlings' revolution, populist revolution, it was sort of like there were formation of these they were kind of like vehicles to drive the revolution. So they were called defense forces. So there were people's defense forces and there were workers' defense forces. And the people's defense forces were supposed to operate within the townships and within the villages and those areas, to help the people in those areas to understand the values and of the revolution, while those in the workers had to enforce the values of the revolution in workplaces. And so those were kind of like they heralded and they spread into the control of the police, the control of the army, and all that. So these social services in Ghana at the time, the police, the army, and all that, were etched under defense forces. And I think I see what probably the ANC imagined South Africa to be at this time. So it argues that, Ramaphosa, according to Ramaphosa, argues that the defense forces, the police and intelligence forces had to be under the control of the civilians, you see. But this civilian now, this control had to be, driven by a certain form of leadership in a civilian ministry that was accountable to the parliament. So this was how it was supposed to be arranged by 1994. And he argues that, the police and these intelligence forces must operate in accordance with the democratic constitution, and they must remain impartial and adhere to clear codes of conduct. The size, composition, and operational doctrines of the new defense force should be suitable for a nation focused on significant socioeconomic construction and development, with clear protection for the rights of its members. So whether the last police minister, Becky Selle, really met with this, I've seen many of your comments. It feels like it was really questionable. And also other police ministers at the time might not have kind of like represented this vision perfectly, and disappointed a lot of South Africans, to the point where South Africa today is being hailed as the murder capital of the world, taking over from El Salvador's Nayib Bukele's country, El Salvador, where Nayib Bukele now argues that El Salvador has become the most peaceful country in the Western Hemisphere. So I thought this was really interesting to really understand Ramaphosa's perspective in 1994 and where he stood. as the ANC tried to transit from a liberation movement to a political force in South Africa that would drive South Africa's movement into a democratic nation. But anyway, what do you guys think about this? What do you guys think about what Neo Debe has actually spoken about here? Ramaphosa almost being a reincarnation of the Codesas Ramaphosa, which has masterfully led, or probably not masterfully anyway, but has led the negotiations for this present government of national unity and has held South Africa to where it is now, that there's a functioning cabinet, and many cabinet members have seen the likes of Gayton McKenzie, have seen the likes of Siviwe Garube of D, and many of them actually seem happy with their positions. What do you guys think about what's going on, what Neo Debe has argued, and this research on President Cyril Ramaphosa of 1994? Share your thoughts in the comments.